Friends, see our chief guest has come. We can start the session now. On behalf of you and our college, Kandasamy Kandu College, Paramathilur Namakkal, and CAPCOM in India, I extend hearty welcome to Professor Rajaram sir. He is a well-known professor, needs no introduction. He is a renowned professor of Annamalai University, Chidambaram, Tamil Nadu. He has published many papers and produced many doctorates. And now we are going to have his lecture. I request Professor Rajaram to enlighten us with his ideas. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your formal introduction. Most respected head of the Department of English of Kandasamy College, Professor Shanti, and other dignitaries, participants, research scholars, and student friends. It gives me immense pleasure to be a part of this international seminar to share some of my experiences as a teacher and as a reader of the text of various writers. The focus on my lecture is literary criticism and what are the common critical approaches that we apply whenever we interpret literature. And to be more specific, I will make you understand some of the common critical approaches. There are 9 critical approaches that we often apply in the interpretation of literary texts. And my focus will be on one of the approaches called reader response criticism. See, as I mentioned, there are 9 common critical approaches to literature. The 9 common critical approaches to literature include formalist criticism, biographical criticism, historical criticism, gender criticism, psychological criticism, sociological criticism, mythological criticism, reader response criticism, and deconstructionist criticism. These are the 9 common critical approaches to the interpretation of literary works. Let me briefly define one by one and center my discussion on reader response criticism. So let me begin with a brief introduction of these 9 common critical approaches. Formalist criticism, this approach regards literature as a unique form of human knowledge that needs to be examined on its own terms. All the necessary elements, all the elements significant, essential for understanding the work are contained within the work itself. Of particular interest to the formalist critic are the elements of form. They center on considering the elements of form. The form which includes style, structure, tone, and imagery. And these are the elements found within the text. A primary goal for formalist critics is to determine how these elements work together with the text content to shape its effect upon readers. This is formalist criticism. Biographical criticism. This approach begins with the simple but central insight that literature is written by actual people and that understanding an author's life can help readers to comprehend the work. So biographical approach highlights that understanding of the author's life is important for analyzing a work of art. Hence, it is often considered, it often offers a practical method by which readers can better understand a text. However, a biographical critic must be careful not to take the biographical facts of a writer too far in criticizing the works of that writer. The biographical critic focuses on explicating the literary work by using insight provided by the knowledge of the author's life. So biographical data should amplify the meaning of the text, not down it with irrelevant material. The next one, historical criticism. As I told you, there are 9 common critical approaches to the interpretation of literature: formalist criticism, biographical criticism, and now historical criticism. So historical criticism, this approach seeks to understand a literary work by investigating the social, cultural, and intellectual context that produced it. A context that necessarily includes the artist's biography and the milieu in which it is produced. So it takes upon the political, cultural, and historical milieu. So a key goal for historical critics is to understand the effect of a literary work upon its original readers. Then gender criticism. This criticism, this approach examines how sexual identity influences the creation and reception of literary works. It's originally an offshoot of feminist movements. Gender criticism today includes a number of approaches, including the masculinist approach advocated by one of the poets, Robert Bly. The bulk of gender criticism, however, is feminist and takes as a central precept that the patriarchal studies that have dominated Western thought have resulted either consciously or unconsciously in literature full of unexamined male-produced assumptions. So feminist criticism attempts to correct this imbalance by analyzing and combating such attitudes by questioning, for example, why none of the characters in Shakespeare's play Othello ever challenge the right of a husband to murder a wife accused of adultery. Other goals of feminist critics include analyzing how sexual identity influences the reader of a text and examining how the images of men and women in imaginative literature reflect or reject the social forces that have historically kept the sexes from achieving total equality. Psychological criticism. Psychological criticism is an approach that reflects the effect that modern psychology has had upon both literature and literary criticism. Fundamental figures in psychological criticism include Sigmund Freud, whose psychoanalytic theories changed our notions of human behavior by exploring new or controversial areas like wish fulfillment, sexuality, the unconscious, and repression, as well as expanding our understanding of how language and symbols operate by demonstrating their ability to reflect unconscious fears or desires. And Carl Jung, whose theories about the unconscious are also a key foundation of the later development that came upon psychological criticism, that is mythological criticism. Psychological criticism has a number of approaches, but in general, it usually employs one of the three approaches: an investigation of the creative process of the artist, what is the nature of literary genius, and how does it relate to normal mental functions. The psychological study of a particular artist usually noting how an author's biographical circumstances affect or influence their motivations and behavior. The analysis of fictional characters using the language and methods of psychology. Then the next one is sociological criticism. This approach examines literature in the cultural, economic, and political context in which it is written or received. It explores this kind of criticism. Sociological criticism explores the relationship between the artist and society. Sometimes it examines the artist society to better understand the author's literary works. At other times, it may examine the representation of such societal elements within the literature itself. One influential type of sociological criticism is Marxist criticism, which focuses on the economic and political elements of art, often emphasizing the ideological content of literature, because Marxist criticism often argues that all art is political. Marxist criticism considers all art as political, either challenging or endorsing the status quo. It is frequently evaluative and judgmental, a tendency that can lead to reductive judgment. Then the next one is mythological criticism. This approach emphasizes the recurrent universal patterns underlying the most literary works. So it combines this type of criticism, mythological criticism, combines the insights from anthropology, psychology, history, and comparative religion. Mythological criticism explores the artist's common humanity by tracing how the individual imagination uses myths and symbols common to different cultures and epochs. The most common key concept in mythological criticism is the archetype, a symbol, character, situation, or image that evokes a deep universal response, which entered literary criticism from the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. According to Jung, all individuals share a collective unconscious, a set of primordial images, a set of primal memories common to the human race, existing below each person's conscious mind, often deriving from primordial phenomena such as the moon, fire, night, and blood. And archetypes, according to Jung, trigger the collective unconscious. And another important critic, Northrop Frye, defined archetypes in a more limited way. He defined archetype in a more limited way as a symbol, usually an image, which recurs often enough in literature to be recognizable as an element of one's literary experience as a whole. So whatever be it, regardless of the definition of archetype they use, mythological critics tend to view literary works in the broader context of works sharing a similar pattern. Well, the next approach is reader response criticism. This approach takes as a fundamental tenet that literature exists not as an artifact upon a printed page, but as a transaction between the physical text and the mind of the reader. Let me repeat it again. This approach, reader response criticism, takes as a fundamental tenet that literature exists not as an artifact upon a printed page. It's not a mere artifact upon the printed page, but it's a transaction between the physical text and the mind of the reader. Reader response criticism attempts to describe what happens in the reader's mind while interpreting a text and reflects that reading, like writing, is a creative process. Not that writing alone is a creative process. Reading, like writing, is also a creative process. According to reader response critics, literary texts do not contain a meaning. Meanings derive only from the act of individual readings. Hence, two different readers may derive completely different interpretations of the same literary text. Likewise, a reader who rereads a work years later may find the work shockingly different. So reader response criticism then emphasizes how religious, cultural, and social values affect readings. It also overlaps with gender criticism in exploring how men and women read the same text with different assumptions. Though this approach rejects the notion that a single correct reading exists for a literary work, it does not consider all readings permissible. Each text creates limits to its possible interpretations. I told you there are 9 common critical approaches to literature: formalist criticism, biographical criticism, historical criticism, gender criticism, psychological criticism, sociological criticism, mythological criticism, reader response criticism, and deconstructionist criticism. So what does deconstructionist criticism aim at? What's the basic tenet of this approach? This approach rejects the traditional assumption that language can accurately represent reality. These critics, deconstructionist critics, regard language as a fundamentally unstable medium. For example, the words tree or dog, for instance, undoubtedly conjure up different mental images for different people. And therefore, because literature is made up of words, literature possesses no fixed single meaning. So deconstructionists insist on the impossibility of making the actual expression coincide with what has to be expressed, of making actual signs coincide with what is signified. As a result, deconstructionist critics tend to emphasize not what is being said, but how language is used in a text. The methods of this approach tend to resemble close to that of formalist criticism, but whereas formalist primary goal is to locate unity within a text, how the diverse elements of a text cohere into meaning, deconstructionists attempt to show how the text deconstructs, how it can be broken down into mutually irreconcilable positions. Other goals of deconstructionists include challenging the notion of authors' ownership of text they create, focusing on how language is used to achieve power, as and when they try to understand how some interpretation of a literary work come to be regarded as truth. See, when we look at reader response criticism, see, we often, whenever we take up a text, whenever we look into the text, we consider, we often look at the creator. We often worship the creator. The creator here, I mean, the creator of the text. See, the text is created by the author. Everyone, see, no one disagrees. No one disagrees that it's the author who created the text. He created only the text. The text was created by him. See, for example, see, we have everything. See, there is a music. Beauty is there. Music is there. There is music. Someone must be there to appreciate the music. Someone must be there to appreciate the beauty. In a similar way, the author is the creator. The author is the creator. He is the creator of the text. But the text cannot survive. The text cannot exist without readers. It is the reader who makes the text alive. It's the reader who makes the text exist. If at all, writers of 14th century or 15th century or 16th century, those writers are alive even in the 21st century, it is all because of the readers. See, I agree, and everyone will agree that the author is the creator of the text. But then the question arises, see, my point here is the reader is also a creator. We often forget, everyone tends to forget the role of the reader. See, the author is the creator of the text. What about the reader? The reader is the creator of meanings. And the creative process of the reader continues. The creative process of the reader continues. The author wrote the text. The author created the text and hasn't modified the text until he lived. He hasn't modified the text. The author hasn't modified the text, but the reader has modified his meanings. And every year the reader reads, he arrives at new, probable, improbable, possible, impossible meanings, and those meanings that he arrives at cannot be ignored. At one point of time, whatever interpretations the reader gives will become acceptable at a later point of time. Let me give you an example of Stanley Fish reading of Tiger. See, we might have read Blake's Tiger several times. The interpretation that Stanley Fish gives, see, what he says, the speaker of the poem, Tiger, the speaker laments. It's a kind of lamentation of the speaker. Lamentation of the speaker in the sense, see, the speaker has tasted two meats. That is the interpretation that Stanley Fish gave. When he took the meat of the lamb, the speaker didn't find any difficulty. The speaker hasn't faced any difficulty when he took the meat of the lamb. And he made a prohibitory violation and he took the meat of the tiger. He took the meat of the tiger. The speaker laments. The speaker laments for his violation of dietary prohibition. He violated dietary prohibition of tasting the meat of a tiger. And he found extreme difficulty in his dietary organs. He found extreme difficulty in the digestive tract. He found extreme difficulty in the digestive tract, and that is why he raises the question, did he who made the lamb made it? This is the interpretation of Stanley Fish. That is why the speaker laments. This is the interpretation given by Stanley Fish. And not that we need to accept this interpretation. And this interpretation may be acceptable at one point of time. So whatever our transaction with the text result in meaning. And my point here is reader is a creator of meanings. So reader response theory is a school of literary theory that focuses on the reader and their experience of a literary work, in contrast to other schools and theories that focus attention primarily on the author or the content and form of the work. It's a school of literary criticism that ignores both the author and the text contents, confining analysis to the reader's experience when reading a particular work. So, reader response stresses the importance of the reader's role in interpreting texts, because all readers bring their own emotions, concerns, life experiences, and knowledge to their reading, and each interpretation is subjective and unique. Conversely, aesthetic reading is a much more personal approach to reading, as it focuses on the reader's relationship to the text. This type of reading allows the reader to create meaning from text and within the text. Thus, the meaning is personal, debatable, and draws on the reader's experience with the text. So, in a general sense, an aesthetic response refers to the reaction a person has to an object based on his or her perception of the object. So, the reaction is based on the qualities and configurability of the physical features of the object. So, an efferent stance results in readers focusing on the public aspects of sense, on referential meanings. When reading or responding to a literary work, it is believed that an aesthetic stance is appropriate. Thus, the aesthetic stance results in attention being focused on the personal, experiential aspects of meaning. The promotion of reader response criticism to the category of things that are done brings with it a whole set of new facts to which its practitioners can now refer. All these include patterns of expectation and disappointment, reversals of direction, traps, invitations to premature conclusion, textual gaps, delayed revelations, temptations, all of which are related to a corresponding set of authors' intentions of strategies designed to educate the reader or humiliate him or confound him in the more sophisticated versions of the mode to make him enact in his responses that very subject matter of the poem. And these facts and intentions emerge when the text is interrogated by a series of related questions. What is the reader doing? What is being done to him? For what purpose? Questions that follow necessarily from the assumption that the text is not a spatial object, but the occasion for a temporal experience. It is in the course of answering such questions that a reader response critic elaborates the structure of the reading experience, a structure which is not so much discovered by the interrogation, but demanded by it. See, the meaning of, for example, the meaning of the text is transactional. Any text, the meaning of the text is transactional. What is this transaction? What do we mean by the meaning of the text is transactional? So the result of the transaction between the reader and a text, the result of the transaction between the reader and a text. See, the reader plus, see, when we arrive at an equation, as we have equations in chemistry, see, the reader plus the text is equal to meaning. The reader is not a passive reader. The reader is an active participant. The reader is an active participant with the text in creating meaning. As I told you earlier, we need to worship the reader because it's the reader who keeps on creating meanings. The reader is the creator of meanings. And the meaning that the reader arrives keeps on changing. It is not a meaning which can be taken into account for several years. Every student of literature will agree with me. Their first reading of a particular, when they were in their student days. See, every year, even every day is a kind of experience, and we apply our experience in our interpretation of a work of art, and the experience brings in a variety of changes within the mind, and the mind keeps on creating new meanings. The mind keeps on creating new various. There are infinite variety of meanings, infinite variety of meanings within that single mind. See, it's the mind which read the poem some time back, and it's the same mind which reads the poem now. And the perception, what happens to the perception of the reader is that the perception of the reader keeps on changing. The reader is not the same. The reader keeps on changing. So there are no single readers. The reader within me, for example, the reader within me keeps on changing. So though the reader may be the same person, but the reader's experience, the reader applies his experience whenever he interprets a poem, whenever he interprets a literary work. So the reader plus the text is equal to meaning. The reader is an active participant with the text in creating meaning, and the reader allows for a wide range of legitimate responses, though there are limitations as well. The reader utilizes gaps. The reader utilizes gaps in the text which are said to exist wherever a reader perceives something to be missing between words, sentences, paragraphs, stanzas, and the chapters. The purpose is to alter the reader's assumptions and characteristic ways of viewing the world. The oftentimes results in the reader's self-discovery to achieve a meaning that agrees with his feelings. The reader also manipulates linguistic elements of the text in order to extract meaning. The reader also brings outside knowledge to the text. He uses this information to derive meaning from the text. So the reader is, as I told you earlier, the reader is the creator. See, in one of his famous essays, Death of the Author, Roland Barthes says, when he makes a definition of a text, what is a text? What is a text? Even the text, he calls text as a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable cultures. A text is not a text. He doesn't define text as a mere text. What is a text? A text is a tissue of quotations. What you call a text is a text as a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable cultures. See, for example, one of the best poems that every one of us might have come across is Eliot's Wasteland, for example. It's a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable cultures, which we can apply this to Eliot's poem, Wasteland. So Wasteland, when you look at the poem, when you look at Wasteland as a whole, you find this. A text is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable cultures. Because Wasteland ends with Shanti, 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 where Eliot brings in the Indian culture. A text is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable cultures. So it's an Indian culture. And also you come across several cultures. Just I'm giving you an example in order to validate Roland Barthes' definition of a text. A text is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable cultures. So as a reader, it's the reader who creates meanings, and that is why he concludes the essay, The Death of the Author, by asserting that the birth of the reader begins at the cost of death of the author. It is not the physical death of the author, but we have to efface. So it must be a transaction between the reader and the text. And the real reader begins when he removes all cultural, historical, authorial background, and he must interpret the text as it is without taking into account the other factors. So only then the reader arrives at new meaning, clear meaning, and then only the reader can be called a real creator. And I conclude this lecture by reiterating that it is the reader who creates meaning, and it is the reader who is the creator of meanings, and it's the reader who makes the text alive by giving and changing his interpretations. Thank you for the opportunity. If anyone wish to have any kind of transaction, I am available to answer you.